Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar talking about facial recognition. What does the future hold? Talking particularly about facial recognition in a commercial context, which is something that Tim Nurst, who's with me from the face recognition company, knows a lot about. Morning, Tim.
Morning, Will. Thank you for joining us today. I think the reason why we thought this would be a worthwhile webinar is when we've done some presentations to potential customers, clients, and we always talk about GDPR and the regulations from 2018, there's always a question, and there's a feeling that it's better not to do something than to do something in certain cases. And we find that just providing a bit more knowledge about what you can do lawfully, well within your rights, once we cover that ground, people go away feel more empowered and more confident and comfortable about going to the next stages and talking about going forward with a trial. And I think today we thought it'd be really good. We've been working with Freeths for many years. In fact, our face recognition system has been built by design with Freeths and their advice right from the beginning. So it's always been at the forefront of our mind to have this recognised. We always address it in our presentations, and it's probably the most important thing to cover off before then you can move on to some other scenarios and how the system works and what we do. I think now what we'll do is that Will's got a few slides, and we're going to sort of open up some general feelings and some questions that we hope are relevant to what we're looking to sort of cover off today, and then we will finish off with hopefully some questions. Will, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. So yeah, as Tim says, I'm going to run through a series of slides, really talking about the future, looking positively at this new technology, understanding it. I recognise that there's going to be quite a diverse mix of sort of levels of familiarity with both the tech and some of the legal principles involved. So we're going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour initially, talking about how it works, how it can be used and the legal implications, and then some of the challenges that those legal requirements present, before then sort of really turning to focus on, well, how does one move forward with using this technology? There's a chat option, a Q&A. If you've got questions, do post them as we go along, and hopefully we'll be able to pick some of those off while we're talking. It's not just going to be my voice sort of droning on for 45 minutes. I'll bring Tim in to talk, and his colleague Chris, who's on the call as well as necessary. But we will leave some time for questions at the end as well. So if there's anything that it isn't easy for us to tackle as we go along, we'll circle back and pick up as many of your questions as we can. Again, as Tim says, you know from experience that this is a subject that produces a lot of questions for people.
And also just to let everyone know about the fact that we are recording this webinar today for our own personal references going forward, just to let everyone know that.
Yeah, okay. So let's start with talking about the technology. Now, this isn't a representation necessarily of how the face recognition company do it. It's more of a very sort of high-level, generalised impression of how this technology works. Just to introduce you to some of the key concepts, and particularly to understand, where this starts to get into the terrain around sort of legal implications. So the starting point is you've got to have an image. That image is captured by a camera. So far, so vanilla. That process is exactly the same as you would have for CCTV, for any other form of image capture. The point at which it engages any additional considerations is in steps 2 and 3 that are shown in this diagram: the detection and then the transformation. The detection is a process by which the faces within the image are found and focused in on, and the transformation is the point at which that facial image is turned into data which represents that person uniquely. That data, because it's data that's about sort of measurements and about body characteristics, is what's known as biometric data. And biometric data, when it's being used for the identification of people, is a category of data which has specific rules that govern it within the GDPR and within data protection law. So that's the point at which we're creating something that engages a sort of fresh legal concept. Those images are then cropped down and isolated, stored with the biometric information and transferred internally within the system for comparison against often a watch list, which will be perhaps another sort of set of photos that have similarly been biometrically processed to identify any possible matches. And then the use of that pattern matching, well, there can be all sorts of uses for that. We'll come on to the range of different sort of use cases as we go along. But that's the technology. Now, often what that means is that for the vast majority of images, they're only being processed for a fraction of a second. They're being detected, they're being compared against that list, and then they're being discarded because there's no match. Only where there is a match does anything pop up on any screen that a human has visibility of. Only then is there the possibility of some further activity based on that recognition, that potential match. And again, we'll talk about the different ways in which an organisation might then look to move forward using that detection for some purpose of its own. So this is not, very clearly, this is not a talk about the law enforcement use of facial recognition. That's governed by a completely separate part of the legislation. Law enforcement is not something that in European law is covered by the GDPR. And so in UK law, what's happened is that there's the first part of the Data Protection Act 2018 that deals with the sort of GDPR commercial processing, private sector processing, and then there are separate sections that deal with processing for law enforcement purposes, that deal with processing for security service purposes. And facial recognition in a law enforcement context has had quite a lot of publicity. There have been cases about it. Some of the principles that have been developed in those cases are applicable in the private sector applications of face recognition, but some of them aren't. And of course, we're not concerned with being able to justify the processing on the basis of law enforcement. And we're not talking about any technology that creates some sort of state-owned database of facial recognition imagery in the way that when you get into public sector processing, slightly different considerations like that arise. So if we're not talking about that, what are we talking about? Well, as I mentioned, the range of different applications that they can be for face recognition are extremely wide-ranging. The most common is probably use for security of people and places, and those can be quasi-public places like this image here, which is of the St Pancras scheme, but also they can be more private commercial spaces, so the interior of stores, museums, art galleries and theme parks, office premises. It might be a research lab for scientific research establishment. There can be all sorts of occasions like that. And in each of those, primarily, the concern is about either identifying people who belong and giving them access, although access control is a slightly sort of separate topic that we won't spend a lot of time on today, or identifying people who don't belong, who pose a threat to the property or to the employees of the organisation, or indeed to any members of the public or customers who are using the space, identifying them and then addressing that threat. In addition, not so much in the UK yet, but certainly in European countries, we're seeing the use of facial recognition in a school context. That might be to validate the identity of participants in an exam, if there are concerns about people impersonating students in order to come and sit exam papers for them, which from time to time rears its head as a consideration. It might be about ensuring that children are safeguarded by preventing people from accessing school premises who are on a watch list because they pose a threat to the children, or even just for sort of access control to make sure that only authorised adults are allowed within the premises. But we've also seen some slightly more innovative applications. In London, there was a trial scheme a couple of years ago which used facial recognition to deal with the much vexed question of making sure that people are served in the order that they arrive at the bar, which seems a bit more trivial, but actually for a lot of people seems to land quite well as an acceptable use of that technology within the pub setting. And we'll come back to this, but one of the really critical things about that was that it was using that data only for a very short period of time during the course of a session of serving, and all of the data would be erased at the end of that evening. So there wasn't any watch list, but it was simply using the information to identify of those people at the bar who was the next one to have arrived, so that they could make sure that they were served in order. And again, as I say, when you start thinking about it like that, you can see that there's all sorts of different innovative uses that might be made. Some headlines about this one: use of facial recognition at gigs. Again, that can partly be directed to ticket fraud and deterring ticket touts, which is obviously a valid commercial objective for organisations. Again, where there started to be some slightly more controversial headlines, slightly more negative coverage, was when it emerged that some festival organisers were allowing access to the feeds for facial recognition to authorities, HMRC and local councils to assess whether people might be benefit cheats or identify people who had unpaid tax bills. Obviously that that type of application again is straying into the public sector use of the data, and where there wasn't a great deal of transparency, which is another theme we'll come back to. That was a lot more controversial and led to more difficulty. So that's just another point to bear in mind. And then finally, in terms of use cases, but there are plenty more. Schiphol Airport, there's also a scheme that's being developed at Heathrow Airport to use facial recognition to address another really vexed problem, which is the amount of time that it takes to pass through security, be recognised and identified by the authorities at the airport, and actually using face recognition together with the biometric information that's already stored in passports to validate people's identity much more quickly, and to massively reduce the amount of time that it takes for people to flow through. So, I think that covers a good range of use cases. Tim, can you think of any other really obvious ones that I've missed?
No, I think it'd be interesting to sort of say a little bit more about on the retail side, and also football stadiums as well. We've seen a lot about this race hate crime going on at the moment, and giving the confidence that if you're using face recognition to catch effectively bad people, you're well within your rights. I think one thing that we, as a company policy, we don't engage with is offering it for VIP detection, because it's open up for abuse, and we'll advise us very early on saying, look, you can put that in, you can offer that, but you can have some real problems with it. And if a company that has got our face recognition system in, if that has a problem and there's bad publicity, then we have a problem as well. So we've really been very strict about saying to our customers what they can and can't do, and follow that through. But yeah, Will, if you can say something a little bit on sort of maybe stadiums and retail.
Yeah, so I mean, again, not particularly in the stadium context, not thinking about the use that the police might make of the technology to identify people who are committing sort of racially motivated crime, for example. But you can imagine that a club might well have their own reasons for monitoring. I mean, they might, I suspect we will see this increasingly, make continued sort of ability to hold season tickets or membership of fan clubs and things conditional on behaviour at stadiums, and using facial recognition to identify people who are involved in wrongdoing in that context might well greatly facilitate their ability to police good behaviour and to ensure that that's dealt with appropriately. But I mean, in the wider sort of retail context, there's all sorts of ways in which you can imagine, even within the constraints that you're talking about, Tim, that you would use that technology. You might be a sort of warehouse type store who's worried about vandalism or theft. You don't necessarily have the staff to monitor CCTV or to constantly be sort of patrolling the aisles, but you might well detect that there are persistent offenders and using a watch list to exclude those from the store at the outset, which of course, as your premises, you're entitled to exclude anyone that you don't want coming in, using that to exclude people who are potentially going to steal from you, or who in the past have been guilty of verbally or physically harassing members of staff or other customers. All of these contribute to a safer and more secure environment for you and your people, but also for your customers. They know that they're somewhere where wrongdoers are going to be sort of excluded from coming in, and that creates a feeling of a safe space, which is obviously really important, particularly at the moment as people are sort of coming back into the physical retail environment. Anything that gives them an extra sense of security, has got to be all to the good. So, having sort of talked about those use cases, we'll take a step back now and just sort of talk about the legal implications. And I touched on this a little bit already. Article 4 defines personal data. Personal data is defined extremely widely. It's basically anything that allows you to identify someone, or that tells you anything about someone who you are able to identify. That includes direct and indirect identifications, so not just their name, but also information that you could use with other data that you hold to be able to identify them, such as a watch list or something like that. And it includes not just written down data, words and numbers, but it also includes physiological and genetic information. So obviously a lot of that potentially not going to be visible in a name or a telephone number, but will be visible within an image of the person. I've mentioned biometric data already, and just to sort of give you the formal definition there, it's something that results from specific technical processing. So you remember I was talking about, it's not immediately biometric data as soon as you get the image, but when you do that specific technical processing within the face recognition tool, that produces information about the physical or physiological characteristics of a person, and gives you something that's uniquely identifies them, such as, and it says particularly facial images, dactyloscopic data, fingerprints. That's all that means. But information about the pattern of whorls and lines on fingertips. So those types of information, when they are elicited from a specific technical process, are biometric data. Why is that relevant? Well, all personal data is subject to these legal principles. We'll come back to these to sort of explain in a bit more detail what they mean as we get a bit further into the talk. But for now, hopefully largely familiar territory for you, but just to understand that those key principles exist. In addition, there is a general principle of accountability. This is one that is really important in this context and that we'll come back with. It's not just that you have to comply with those other principles, you have to be able to demonstrate how you comply with it. that means writing it down. It means documenting the processes you've gone through to assure yourself of compliance. And then, so we'll look at these now in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to go through this in an awful lot. These slides will be available after the talk, but I don't really want to take up a lot of time today because I would expect that quite a lot of people that are attending this are already familiar with these sort of fairly broad concepts. But it's just to understand when you process data, you've got to have a lawful basis for it. You've got to be doing it fairly and you've got to be doing it transparently. And already, in some of the examples that I've given you, you can see how people might fall foul of that. It's not fair to process data for a different purpose than the one that people have been told about. If they go to a gig and they think that imagery is being used for their safety, and actually it's being used to identify people who have debts, to be able to pursue them or intercept them, as they leave the venue, well, that's not a fair use unless it's been made explicitly clear ahead of time that that's how it's going to be done. It's got to be lawful, so you've got to have a proper basis for the processing of the data, and we'll come back to that, and transparent. You've got to have a privacy notice or something that describes that processing activity. The one thing I will particularly draw your attention to on this slide is the last bullet point, Article 9, and that imposes extra conditions where special category data is being processed. Now, that can be all sorts of things. It can be data about someone's gender or sexuality, their race, political affiliations, whether they're a trade union member. But one of the categories of special category data is biometric data that's being used for the purpose of uniquely identifying a natural person. And part of the lawfulness requirement is that when you're doing that processing, you've got to have some extra layer of lawfulness to satisfy that. Now, that might be for vital interests of the business or the individual. It might be to process or to establish, exercise or defend legal claims. It might be for public health reasons. You might have a list of characteristics that presented a risk to public health that you were on the lookout for. But it might also be for where someone's given explicit consent. That can be quite difficult in sort of wide field facial recognition, which is one of the reasons why, as Tim said, there are certain categories of use which are more difficult to do in public spaces. But it's certainly one to be aware of as being possible in the right circumstances. Purpose limitation, you shouldn't be keeping the data for any longer than you need it, and you shouldn't be collecting any more than you need in the first place. Tim made an interesting comment about the way in which their solution has been sort of designed from the ground up with privacy in mind. And that data protection by design, that privacy by design, is a really important characteristic. It's something that GDPR specifically highlights as a way of safeguarding data and the expectation that people will design tools that have an impact on privacy with that privacy sort of baked in from the ground floor up. Again, I'm not going to sort of spend a lot of time on these, but just understand that having defined your set of purposes, having sort of said this is what it's going to be used for, you've got to try and stick to that. The scope to expand to other processes, it's not impossible by any means, but it requires you to go back and re-notify people. You can't simply say, well, we've got that data set, we're now going to use it for X, Y, and Z as well, and never tell anyone about it. I've talked about fairness, I've talked about accuracy. Certainly some of the early bad press that face recognition got, again, in the law enforcement context, derived from the fact that the tools that were being used were not terribly accurate. There's an 81% failure rate referred to there in a Metropolitan Police trial, but I mean that's from quite a few years ago now. And there's a particular concern, as a lot of people will be aware, with sort of racial and gender bias. That, again, it varies very greatly from provider to provider, but where people have rather lazily used old photographic data sets, often there was an overwhelming sort of preponderance of those being made up of white males. And consequently, the AI tools that have been trained for sort of pattern recognition purposes were much more familiar with the characteristics of the white male face than they were with female faces or the faces of people of colour. And in each of those cases, the result of that, predictably, was that those tools would yield a disproportionately high number of false positives. So people would be recognised as being someone other than who they were if that person was female or female presenting, or if they were a person of colour. And those things are being addressed, and certainly something that everyone should be really alert to if they're looking at deploying that technology now. But it is something that you have to be on your guard against because of these obligations under GDPR, of course, because it's just right that you shouldn't be using technology that has a discriminatory effect generally. There's a mention there of data protection impact assessments. We're going to come back to that. Oh boy, are we going to come back to that a bit later on. So I'm not going to really talk about that more now. Integrity and confidentiality, I'm going to sort of skip over that, but I mean, essentially it's about keeping the data safe. It's about making sure that it doesn't get into the wrong hands or is used for the wrong purposes. I think that's probably, in terms of the sort of general principles, legal principles, that's probably about as much as we've either got time for or we need to say around that. Tim, should we sort of move into talking a bit about people's sort of impressions of the technology, and then really get quite quickly into how those are addressed and the way in which we, in practice, are able to deploy this in a way that meets those concerns?
Yeah, I think so. Then we've got some questions as well, which we must allow some time for. But yeah, I mean, I think face recognition has been around for many years. I've been involved in the sector for a good time. I think one of the first things that people will say is, it's not very accurate. And yeah, a few years ago, they'll be right. There was a lot of false negatives, a lot of false positives. And it doesn't take too long before it loses credibility with the system. And I think, certainly speaking for my own company, being the face recognition company, is that when we set about this, there was 6 really important things, and hopefully I can remember them, that you had to have as part of the solution. And if you were missing one of them, then you're going to fall down at some point. And the first thing is accuracy. As I said, if you're not there on accuracy, then it's not going to work. If you've got a security guard that's managing it and using it, and he's getting false alerts all the time, within 24 hours, he's just not going to be proactive, and it's not going to work. And if he doesn't get the alerts, then he doesn't get effectively the recognition of what that could be saving them if it was in a retailer, for example, and therefore not the return on investment. So it's really important, it's accuracy. The price has got to be there. It's got to be affordable. There's no point saying the system is fantastic, but it's going to cost X hundreds of thousands, because it's not going to take off. It's got to be robust. And as Will was talking about, in sort of all scenarios, it's got to be able to work. It's got to be, now we've got face mask situations, so you've got to have something that can deal with that. Otherwise, again, that's you're dead in the water. And I think, with COVID, and hopefully that's passing in some time, but we're going to see criminals that are going to be using this opportunity to wear face masks for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and they would just say, look, I haven't had a vaccination, I don't want to take the risk. So that's a problem. Scalability is the next point. It's all very well putting it into one place, but if you can't put it into hundreds or thousands of sites, then it's not fit for purpose. And I think that's important to recognise. The GDPR, which what is all about today, is something that's really got to be considered right the way through the process. And I think there's a question that's come up, which I want to raise in a moment about it. But I think trying to give people the comfort about what they can and can't do, as I touched on earlier with GDPR. It's amazing once you've had those conversations, and we involve Freeths and Will in helping that. If we're presenting to a customer And we've sometimes had Will to come on, and they followed up as well with conversations, which we're happy to pay for that, because if it's a customer of ours, we'd much rather get them to have the right advice so that they can think, okay, that box is ticked now, let's look at the next stages and things like that. But really, GDPR is a very important element of the whole solution, and to really start, there's no point moving forward until you address that. I think hopefully that was around about 6 things, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, Will.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that's right. There's a whole mix of different considerations at play here, and one of the challenges, there's a sort of a challenge both within business but also within the public at large, a sort of concern about the technology that stems not from anything that's been done to them individually or any way in which their personal data has been used, but by, on the last slide we saw, the way in which this technology is used in films and in stories, is often very negative. It's often a sort of an arm of, Big Brother and, state overreach and these types of issues that just associate it naturally in people's head with concern. Now, we've seen a gradual evolution of that perspective. This slide sort of illustrates really a slightly split position that the ICO had for a few years, where they were on the one hand extremely negative about data processing in the law enforcement context for face recognition purposes, while simultaneously running a regulatory sandbox that encouraged developers of facial recognition tools to come forward, to engage with them and to try and produce those real world innovative solutions that are mentioned in that quote. That has changed, and really that's not about the law, and it's not particularly about the technology, which is evolving, but it's always been evolving. Instead, really, it's about an understanding that this sort of technology is around for the long term, and that every technology that's been used has initially met with resistance and concern until it can be properly regulated, until it can be properly understood. And that standing a little bit like King Canute and sort of saying, go back, isn't the answer to that. That instead, really, you need to engage constructively with new technology as it emerges and try and find a way to work with it that sort of regulates things. Now, there have been a number of factors that have accelerated that change. There's the imminent leadership change at the ICO, which is being used by the government to try and refocus them more on the second strand of data protection, which is about ensuring that the data can actually be used for purposes rather than simply being exclusively about protection. Brexit has played its part. We do have an opportunity to move into a slightly more light touch regulated approach compared to the rest of Europe. And there may be some competitive advantages for the UK to doing that if they want to sort of foster technology innovation and make sort of hotbed of talent, but also COVID. Really, one of the early illustrations of that last point is the way in which the UK were able to quite quickly and with a lot more agility than mainland Europe start doing the research on vaccines, using large-scale data sets of very sensitive personal information, much more sensitive than facial imagery, but using it for research purposes. And actually, our success in production of the vaccine does stem, at least in part, from that ability to very quickly get a plan of action that was signed off, that was secure, that protected data, but that allowed it to be used for innovation and research in a way that Europe sort of lagged behind. And as I say, a more greying and mature sort of view of the public's slightly more maturing attitude to their technology, all of which is synthesised into this opinion published in June about the use of live facial recognition technology in public places. I see that we've got a couple of questions that are coming. We will probably pick those up as we go through this next section, but I do just want to sort of introduce the opinion first before we start getting into the detail and probably picking off those questions along the way. The opinion is not covering everything. There's been a previous opinion about law enforcement use, which was pretty negative. but this is about the commercial application of the technology, and is very carefully sort of focused on that. It's also looking at live facial recognition. So that is the capture of images of people moving through a public or quasi-public space, rather than one-to-one uses, such as, for example, opening your iPhone with your face, rather than using a PIN or a fingerprint, although of course fingerprints are another form of biometric technology. Some of the access control use cases that I talked about, those are very much on an individual sort of one-to-one basis, and so not really within scope of what the ICO is concerned about. Although I will say that a lot of the same principles apply as we work our way through them, and not for domestic use. So we're not talking about the sort of face recognition that might be used in the home by a smart screen or something like that, to identify visitors or people who are in a private space. But it does mean sort of pretty much everywhere else. So not just public parks and highways, but also privately owned spaces where the public can be expected to be. And that might be offices, it might be leisure venues, malls, and so forth. Within that, as I say, there's a particular focus on the use of technology for identification and categorization. Again, that means that some of those other applications that might be used fall somewhat outside of the scope, but really the main things that we would be talking about anyway, the main ways in which this is used, surveillance, and to a lesser extent, because it is a bit more problematic from a lawful basis point of view, marketing activities are probably the main ways in which you see that technology deployed. So within their opinion, a range of concerns sort of emerged, and these are perfectly sort of legitimate concerns, and they're concerns that everyone really should be thinking about when they come to start the process of thinking about deploying the technology. So you've got to be on your guard against automatic large-scale collection of biometric data without a clear justification for it. The ICO talks a little bit about statistics and public sentiment around this, and what clearly emerges from that is that the more clearly you've defined what your purpose is for the processing, the more people understand exactly what will and won't happen with their data, the more comfortable they will be with it. Now, that's a slightly different point to whether or not they consent to the processing, and we'll come on because that's one of the questions we've had to talk about, whether or not consent is necessary in this context, but it's about the impact that it has on people if you are using the technology, and understanding how you minimise that, so that just for their peace of mind, for their comfort, and obviously for all the associated implications for your brand and your reputation, you can make sure that everyone is at ease with what you're doing. There has to be control, there has to be consultation, and there has to be a process of understanding, what concerns there are, and trying, if you can, to meet some of those. There has to be transparency, that openness. You've got to make sure they're effective and accurate. We've already talked about that because of the potential for bias and discrimination. You've got to be sure that the right people are ending up on the watch list. It's all very well if the use of the technology is all right, but if you've got people who are being added for the wrong reasons to the watch list, and that's about your internal controls when you deploy this, that of course has to be viewed with caution, as does the possibility of what I've described as escalation. That process that I talked about at the end of the workflow slide, where as it progresses, you get to the point where you've triggered a potential match, and there's some human intervention, or there's some escalation to a member of staff to take action. And obviously, that's the point at which there has to be good governance of the process, understanding that there's a statistical possibility of a match, rather than this is a sure thing that people should act on unthinkingly. And that's really a very important point in that context. And then finally, but by no means least, considerations that everyone should have in mind about processing of children's data and the data of vulnerable adults. That's something that you should be thinking about anyway. There's now a children's code in place. So if you're likely to have children visiting your website, if you're likely to have children in your physical environment, you need to be thinking about how you're addressing their rights and their freedoms anyway, but particularly if you're using something like CCTV technology or facial recognition technology. So, right, having talked about all of that, let's move on to some practical tips. How do we actually synthesize all of that knowledge into some steps to achieve compliance? The ICO, in their opinion, very helpfully in bold marked out around 10 sort of areas where they would expect people to be able to show that they have worked to address particular aspects of compliance if they're thinking about moving to deploy the technology. The first of those is identifying a specified, explicit and legitimate purpose for using the live facial recognition, that's what LFR stands for, in a public place. There's got to be a clear outcome and benefit, and there's got to be a limitation on the original purpose sort of moulding over time or transforming into something else. Tim, any thoughts about that? I mean, this is something you were talking about already in terms of the restrictions around.
Well, we've had a question in about the ICO, and I just thought I'd raise that. I know we're going to come to some questions in a minute, and I think we'll do questions in a few minutes. Your clock on your screen is a little bit behind, Will, so we need to. But I just want to bring this question because it's relevant to what you've been talking about. What is the current position with the ICOs, i.e. the Information Commissioner's Office, and using face recognition tech? Now, you've covered a bit of that, but interestingly, I can correct me if I'm wrong, but Elizabeth Denham, who's a commissioner, I think released a statement in June time that was saying about the fact that whilst there are, there are quite a lot of restrictions about using it, but she also believes that it's a very powerful tool used in the right way. And I think you add a bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's right. The
positive.
Yeah, so when this opinion that I'm talking about was released, there was a sort of press release that came along with it, and that that did recognise that there are a whole range of legitimate purposes that can be acceptably used for this technology, and I think that really is. I talked a little bit already about that, but I think that really does represent a bit of a step change from the ICO, recognising that these purposes do exist, they are out there, and that with the right guidance, following all of the steps that we're about to sort of talk about, you can actually get to a point where you can use the technology without too much concern about falling foul of that legislation, provided that you're working within it, provided that you're sort of thinking about the right considerations.
And I think, as you say, I think that's really, really important, because I think for many years, customers, companies, individuals have been concerned about the ICO position, and I think that June statement really allowed us to, recognise that face recognition does have a place to play, but within the guidelines, within the regulations, and properly done. Yeah,
totally. Having identified that purpose, you've got to have a lawful basis for pursuing it. And one of the questions we've been asked is about consent and the difficulty where you wouldn't necessarily be able to collect the consent of every person moving through a space, and some of them might actively not consent to it. The reality is that consent for this type of processing is seldom going to be the right lawful basis to rely on. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. Part of it is that it's very difficult to be confident that each person that moves into the space has had all of the information that you would want them to have before they gave a consent that was valid. But also there are difficulties around what happens if that consent is withdrawn, during the course of someone's visit within a space. But also there's often a power imbalance. You're not necessarily on a level playing field when you've got a consumer on the one hand and a big organisation on the other. So for all of those reasons, consent is not likely to really be the right lawful basis to rely on. Sometimes you'll be processing in order to comply with a legal obligation. It may well be that you're operating premises that are subject to security considerations. It may well be that you've got some sort of monitoring requirement for which face recognition is the best way of meeting that obligation. But again, that's somewhat unlikely. Otherwise, you're relying on legitimate interests. Now, that's a basis that ought to be familiar to everyone. But essentially, it requires you balancing the rights and interests of the business in deploying this technology with the rights and interests of the individuals in having their data processed. And you need to have a mechanism for them to express concerns about that and to be satisfied that you're striking that balance correctly in favour of their rights over, if those rights are likely to be overridden by or prejudiced by the purposes that you're pursuing. You need to be satisfied that you're able to strike that balance appropriately and meet any concerns that might be expressed. That's challenging, but it's one of the ways, one of the things that's addressed through following a proper impact assessment process that we'll come on to. Because I'm conscious that we do want to leave time for questions, I'm just going to sort of rattle through these next few a little bit more quickly. It is necessary, as I've said already, to identify specific conditions for processing of special category data. What the ICO says is that really you need to be looking at Schedule 1 to the 2018 Data Protection Act. That lists a whole range of substantial public interest conditions that might well satisfy this processing. Those include the deterrence of fraud, detection of fraud. They include the exercise of legal rights by the business. So, for example, in some of the use cases we were talking about around shoplifting or the concern about assault or protection of staff, those would be factors that might feed into that. But it's going to be a case-by-case analysis, looking at that list of conditions, understanding your purpose, and often there'll be an element of needing to narrow the purpose to make sure that it does fall sort of fairly and squarely within one of those exemptions, because otherwise, that is a barrier to processing. Again, in a one-to-one context, you might be able to rely on explicit consent, but I think it's, as the questioner has sort of identified, it's very difficult to envisage a situation where you could comfortably rely on explicit consent, which is the Article 9 version of consent, as the basis for your processing of any image data at scale. And then really emerging organically from all of those points that I've made so far, it's got to be necessary, it's got to be targeted and effective. If there is a simpler, less intrusive way of doing the same thing, then that's what you should be doing. But there will be circumstances, and again, you would need to identify these on a case-by-case basis, but there'll be circumstances where actually there's no meaningful way of achieving the same objective. And an example might be sort of child safeguarding in a large public space, like a theme park or at a festival or something like that. There may be no other way of really achieving that objective without some use of face recognition. And if you were satisfied that you could strike the balance correctly and protect the individuals appropriately, then that's what you would rely on as your basis for doing it. So that the next point really picks up on that and talks about thinking about alternative measures, and again, proportionality is another way really of sort of saying the same thing. You've got to be able to justify the intrusion from a privacy perspective of what it is that you're hoping to do. Thinking about those points about proportionality, Tim, anything you want to add on those?
Yeah, well, I think we've another question here saying, what exact paperwork is required to be completed to then be able to use facial recognition in my shops? Now, I know there's a data protection impact assessment required, which is DPIA, which you can tell a little bit more about. And I think signage is something that's quite important, because all these things that you're saying, like a controller must do this, a controller must do, you kind of think, okay, that's quite daunting. But actually, when you look at a data protection impact assessment, and when I did one for the first time, I managed to complete about 80% of it. Then had some input, and then Chris, my colleague, actually, he was part of the 80%, to be fair with me. But then we went to you for some other bits. So actually, it condenses down to quite a straightforward document once you've got through it. Yeah. Do you want to just mention that? Yeah, and also if there's anything else. So basically, they want to know what they've got to do.
Yeah, no, you're right. That is an important point to make, because when I'm talking about all of these steps around
And 2 minutes, if you can.
Yes.
Well, because I've got some more questions.
When I'm talking about all of these points around compliance, it's really very important to understand what I mentioned earlier on about the accountability principle. You've got to be documenting it. And one of the ways that you do that is through a properly filled out impact assessment. Now, done properly, that will guide you through all of these considerations about the impact, about the proportionality, about the availability of alternatives, also other factors like consultation. You might need to consult with the ICO, you might need to consult with affected individuals. If you were deploying a scheme to monitor workforce, for example, you might need to consult with any representative body in respect of your employees to understand what their concerns were. Now, that doesn't give the employees necessarily a veto over you deploying the technology, but it does mean that you're listening to what their concerns are and how those might be impacted, and then documenting that as part of the overall evaluation of really what you come down to at the end. How much impact is this going to have? Is it the least impact that we can have and still achieve our purposes? And then with that impact, how are we going to mitigate that? How are we going to address that in a way that we can be comfortable actually meets the concerns that are being expressed to us?
Okay, well, thank you. Another good question here. Why has there been predominantly negative publicity around using face recognition technology? Now, correct me if I'm wrong again, but there was a situation with St Pancras Station a few years ago, I can't remember when, and that was in the papers, and I think that was because they didn't complete the data protection impact assessment. Well,
as I understand it, yes, that's right. But the broader point about this, and it really comes to what holds on the next slide conveniently, is this historic concern about the effectiveness and the accuracy of the technology. When there is uncertainty, when there is the sense that the technology is producing biased results, particularly where there's a sense that it's producing a discriminating outcome for people in vulnerable groups or people who are already discriminated against in other ways, obviously that is of a particular concern, and people are rightly sort of sceptical of technology that can't deliver a fair outcome. Now, I don't know whether there's anything you want to sort of say about that point particularly, but I think that does address
another way is saying, look, have you heard the negative publicity that we've seen, certainly where we're focusing more on the private sector? So has there been any situations where it's been other than the lack of paperwork completed? So in terms of negative publicity, has it been just about paperwork, or is there something else? I mean, obviously we know about the accuracy in the past.
Yeah, I mean,
as I understand it, it's just.
I think in terms of commercial applications, that tends to be really the area where people, where they fall down, because I mean, it's probably not all about that. But if people haven't done that impact assessment, if they haven't documented their thinking, the reality is they probably haven't done that thinking. And so it's about something wider than just paperwork. It's about the fact that it points to a lack of taking this seriously, a failure to really sort of think about this as an exercise that needs a bit of deliberation and a bit of consideration. None of these questions that I'm sort of identifying, none of them are particularly difficult to answer. If you are trying to do something which is a sort of sensible, proportionate scheme. If you're trying to do something really sort of out there, you might find it quite difficult, but that's probably more about the nature of the scheme that you're trying to operate, where you're using it to keep your people safe, where you're using it to guard against shoplifting, where you're using it to safeguard children and young people. There will be a case to be made, and working through these questions will not stop you from operating a scheme, but it will mean that when you operate it, you're much less vulnerable to challenge, and you've got a much better chance of actually deploying something that's good for you, but also good for the members of the public that are sort of impacted by it. I mentioned child safeguarding. There was a question about use of the technology in the edtech sector. And that is, that's a particularly challenging area because it does bring in considerations around vulnerable sort of young people in particular, and the ways in which you need to communicate with them. And that really just leads us on to this final slide, which is about transparency, about delivering clear information to everyone who's going to be impacted by the technology. And where that is a child, obviously that transparency needs to be particularly clear. You might want to think about, rather than just producing a sort of privacy notice or signage that's what might mean something to adults, but might be a bit more confusing to younger people, producing something like a cartoon that explains to them exactly, this is how your image has been collected, this is how we're using it, this is how we're keeping it safe. All of the information that you ought to be conveying to them within a privacy notice, but in a format that's more accessible. You might want to think about a short video, depending on the nature of the site and the intrusiveness of the technology, but a short video to explain to people how it can be used. And just like with CCTV, you need to think about people who might not be able to see the signage, or who might not be able to hear an audio announcement, and make sure that you've got a comprehensive scheme of signs and notices and warnings, so that anyone who ought to know about it has the right information brought to their attention sort of ahead of time.
Okay, we've just got probably 4 minutes left, and just some of our listeners might have a hard stop in the 4 minutes. So I've just got 2 questions, which part you've just discussed, but the question is the paperwork required? Is the paperwork required different to what you have to complete for using CCTV? Now, there's not a lot, but there is a bit, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, you would follow, if you've done as you should have done, if you've done an impact assessment for your deployment of CCTV, then you will follow very much the same process. The considerations will be a bit different because you're doing biometric processing that you're not really doing in a CCTV context. So you're going to need to think about that added consideration. You're going to have to recognise the fact that people might be more comfortable with CCTV than they are with face recognition. So you're going to need to think about, well, is there anything extra that we need to reassure them about to understand? And I mean, for example, Tim, I know that, there's controls that you have in place about, the fact that data can't leave the site.
Yeah.
And, being able to actually bring that to people's attention and make sure that they understand it will help to address what you might identify as an additional concern that might not be there with CCTV, which these days, has been around for years and is pretty well established in people's minds. But the broad principle, as I say, in this final point on the last slide, the impact assessment is the impact assessment. What the impact is will vary every time you do an impact assessment, but the process is very similar to what you really ought to have done when you're doing a CCTV deployment or any other deployment of technology that has a privacy.
It's not a lot of difference, is it? There's a little bit more, but I think many people might realise that actually they should have completed a CCTV, data protection impact assessment, and they haven't done. Well, and maybe with face recognition now coming to range of things, people are starting to realise and look at their policy and, we don't have that for CCTV.
And I suppose just as a final point on that,
I've got one very quick one.
Well, I'll just say
quite important, this one.
Yeah, I think it might be the same point if you see the question I've seen, but it's about the fact that really when you're going to do this, you ought to be working with your supplier. In the same way that if you deploy a piece of software, you want to get information from the supplier about what their cybersecurity arrangements are and how they're safeguarding the data if they're putting it into the cloud. Where the server's located, all of those sorts of things. Well, you should be doing due diligence in the same way of your supplier. And I know that Tim might be saying this, but a good supplier will work with customers and actually share probably some of their conclusions from the impact assessment that they will have done as a developer of the technology to help to sort of inform your.
Completely. If we've got a customer that's putting our face recognition system in, we've got to be aligned, and it's not really selling a system and then moving on. It's a live document, these data protection impact assessments. So it's working with them, make sure they're aligned with what needs to be the case, requiring legal assistance if required. So everything is perfect. And also it allows that customer to feel really empowered with what they can and can't do with using face recognition technology. And it's a hugely powerful tool, very efficient if used in the right way. And that's what we're all about. And really quick, if people can still hang on. I've got one relevant question, William. And this is my last one, and then we must finish. But the question is, I see the benefits of using face recognition and I want to install it, but I have brand protection concerns. How can I protect that if I was to proceed with an installation? Well, this is exactly the point we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So that, I mean, that's a really valid point, because a lot of people, I mean, we talked about the sentiment, you know, a lot of people, their concern is not so much about what the technology can actually do, but it's about the sense that's given by using it. And the way to address that is to be open, you know, is to be transparent, is to talk about all the steps that you've taken to be satisfied that when you use this technology, it's safe, that it's got a positive purpose. The more you can talk about public benefit, the more you can talk about substantial public benefit, which is possible, you know, even in a relatively small scale deployment, because it's feeding into broader public protection, it's feeding into, you know, safeguarding of stores, assets and personnel. You know, all of those things will help to reassure people that this is something that's been carefully thought through, that it's not some part of some big brother sort of mission creep, but nor is it being used frivolously or for unnecessary, disproportionate purposes. I think if you can do all of that, if you engage with your customers or your employees or whoever it is that's impacted, and then you show that you've listened and that you've adapted your scheme to address those considerations. You know, my strong sense is that actually this can emerge as a very positive sort of brand impact for you, because it can show you as being a responsible controller of data and someone who, at the end of the day, is motivated by protecting their people and by the visitors to their environment.
Yeah, no, good. Brilliant. Will, thank you very much. I think we're 1 minute over time here. Thank you all for listening. We really hope it's been useful. We've had some more questions which we will try and answer. If you do have some further questions, then feel free to contact myself at Face Recognition Company or Will at Freeths, and we'd be happy to accommodate and follow up with anything further you'd like to discuss.
I think we're going to get the slides sent around. On the front page of the slides, Tim's email address and mine are both there, and as Tim says, really happy to hear from people anytime with any questions that they've got.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and you know, have a good rest of the day.